So, we've just seen a spectacular case of anti Hindu misinformation play out, a case that collapsed when it actually got to court. And the protagonist in this case was none other than the US government itself in the form of the Civil Rights Department. Richard G., could you give us a summary of how this case came about and how it's played out in the courts?
Yes, Navita ji. I actually want to go a little bit, step a little bit back, and I want to talk about how a narrative is built. Because if you look at what happened in the 2000s, Indian Americans were projected in media as a model minority. And, there was a constant, stories of success being played in the media because there were CEOs in the Silicon Valley, startups that were founded by Indian Americans. And it became a common phrase that Indian Americans are model minorities. Their crime rates are low. They overtook the Jews as the ethnic minority with the highest per capita income. And so the story was very good. And then suddenly, we see a series of things happening after 2016. We see the Equality Lab survey come out, which stayed under the radar for some time. It was clearly debunked as a fake and unscientific survey by many of us. But then we had in 2020 everything ramping up. In June 2020, a case came out, which is the Cisco case, which we are discussing today, and in which two managers were called out as discriminating by caste by an anonymous self-identifying Dalit, John Doe. And this case is one of the cases that the Civil Rights Department would have handled. And typically, nobody names the managers. It's usually the company like Cisco that would come out as a small press release in the local papers. But this case was splashed across media. And as I counted, there were 53,000 mentions of caste in less than a year. And the papers are full of caste stories and how Indians are not the model minority that they are thought of, but they bring with them a dark, secret, which is the caste, and caste discrimination. And then there was this book by Isabel Wilkerson, which made caste a household name because, of course, it was promoted by Oprah in her Oprah Book Club, by New York Times as a bestseller. And then caste was equated as race. And that really brought about, further developed the narrative. There was a survey, Carnegie Endowment survey, which also came out in August, around the August 2020. And if that had been a survey as they would have imagined, where Indian Americans would have come out as a caste discriminating community, I think the narrative would have been complete. But that survey showed clearly that Indian Americans are not caste is a diluted identity in the diaspora, and they do not experience caste discrimination here. So all in all, a bad survey, a fake case, which we found out later that Cisco case, one swallow does not a summer make. I always say that if there was a case, in 2020, we sort of assumed, okay, maybe there was this case that happened. But we found out later that this case was also a manufactured case. And there is a website called castgate.org where I was one of the several volunteers who looked at the court documents. And we were on a fact-finding mission to understand this case. And we found that not only was the case manufactured, the John Doe was hired by Sundar Iyer, who was one of the accused. So, it's the same actor inference, which is why Cisco did not take any action when it was an HR complaint. And also we found that the other candidate who was promoted in place of John was also a Dalit candidate. So the CRD department, Civil Rights Department, did not interview the candidate who was promoted. They continued to hide some of these facts in front of the judge. And the case was dismissed only after a motion for sanctions was filed by the defendants, Sundar Iyer and Ramana Kampela. And so to avoid the penalties and egg on the face, CRD withdrew the case forever with prejudice, which means they'll never be able to file that case again. So this is the story of how caste narrative was built in the United States. And the Indian Americans are today facing this not only in terms of the survey, the Equality Lab survey, which is being used despite the Carnegie Endowment survey. And despite the Cisco case having been dismissed, they are still using it in media narratives. And thirdly, as you know, the policies coming about where caste is going to be embedded into the Civil Rights Act. So we have a big fight ahead. And of course, Panditji coming here was a big boost for us to, understand and see the, equations that the similarities between UK and the United States. So yeah, big battle ahead there. Thank you so much.
It's interesting. Let me just try and summarize for the viewers what I've heard from you and what I've read in the papers myself. So in this case, the CRD fabricated evidence. So they alleged that the Dalit, this John Doe, was on low pay, but actually he was earning millions more than his so-called Brahmin boss. They also hid the fact that Sundaraya, the Brahmin boss, had given all the top jobs to Dalits, which is positive discrimination, if anything. I also read that they made outrageous claims of Dalits being raped and assaulted by upper caste Hindus when there's no police reports, there's no media evidence, there's no convictions. I mean, there's just no evidence. I also read that they deliberately misinterpreted Hinduism. They defined caste as a strict Hindu social hierarchy, when anybody who's done a little bit of research will know that caste is actually an imposed construct by the colonizers. And if anybody wants to know more about caste, we'll put a link in the description below which explains how caste itself was forced upon Indian society by the colonizers. And, Panditji, this is a bit strange, isn't it? Because the way the CRD seemed to have misrepresented the facts of the case, this must qualify as misinformation, which is false information deliberately designed to mislead. That's exactly what they seem to have done here. So on the one hand, you have a government that's trying to criminalize misinformation. And then on the other hand, you have a government department actively engaging in it to target Hindus. There's some sort of rich irony in here, isn't there, Panditji?
Well, if it wasn't so pernicious and so malicious, it would actually be quite ridiculous. It's almost as though the state government in California is suffering from, at best, schizophrenia and possibly even worse, multiple personality disorder, with a little bit of psychosis and psychopathy thrown in. It might be worth somebody putting together a psychological profile of the state government as though it was an individual. In fact, I think I will enjoy doing that myself. But you're right. This is not misinformation. This is worse than misinformation. This is exactly akin to a hate-based propaganda exercise. This is identifiable as such, the elements of it. You've identified some of them step by step. Richa very clearly has delineated for us the specifics about a case, the elements of which are now part of the statutory court process. And so they're visible and available as evidence for everybody else to have a look at. Richa, I noted that you said one swallow does not a summer make. And in this case, there wasn't even a swallow. It was a fabrication, a mirage. So there is an illusory swallow, and out of it they have created this great big edifice that Hindus are terrible. This is clearly an exercise in hate mongering. And if I can just contribute a little bit in terms of the profile, I was asked by many people to help compare and review what had happened in California with what had happened in the UK. And it's exactly the same process. Conventionally, if there is a complaint, an attempt is made at mediation. We get the various parties around a table, you sit down with them, you work out and really pick apart all of the individual bits, and then you try and find some common ground. The best solution forward for everybody, a win-win. Mediation is normally the first process. It was absent here in the United Kingdom, and it's absent there in California. The next thing I noticed was that there was no consultation done with the target community, i.e. the Hindu community. No consultation prior to legislation. That's exactly what happened here in the United Kingdom. And so how did they then get this legislative process underway? They relied on reports. Here in the United Kingdom, we had that infamous NISA report, where the managing director of NISA, the organization itself, said it had never been prepared to be used for legislation. The budgets that they had been given were grossly inadequate, it was largely anecdotal, and there was no police evidence of any of the cases that had been included. And yet it was produced in Parliament and touted as being a peerless work of academic research. Strikingly, the Equalities Labs report is exactly the same, totally lacking in quality, no evidence, purely anecdotal propaganda. That was remarkably similar as well. And the process on the basis of that report that ensued was exactly the same. Defamation and vilification, followed by a rush to legislate, exactly as we saw here in the United Kingdom. You may recall the Equalities and Human Rights Commission here in the United Kingdom, supposedly tasked with the, shall we say, with the prerequisite of being unbiased, unprejudiced in all of its work, rushed to publish its opinion. I don't know if you recall, but it said, oh yes, caste is a terrible thing, it inflicts the Hindu community, and we have to get rid of this scourge. No unbiased, objective approach there. And lo and behold, we have the Californian Civil Rights Department doing unbelievably, shall we say, an unbelievable acts of prejudice. On what basis and with what justification did they rush to announce the name of the defendant? Surely they should have been concerned that if we announce the name of this defendant, he will suffer a backlash. And yet what they did is they announced and broadcast his name, whilst at the same time asserting that the plaintiff's name needed to be protected because he would suffer a backlash. And in fact, there is no evidence to support the claim that he would suffer a backlash, nor that he has suffered a backlash. So you can see that the parallels are remarkable. And here in the United Kingdom, when it became apparent that this was an exercise in hate mongering, an exercise in seeding hatred and causing community conflict, the government of the day decided that no, on the basis of the evidence, there were no grounds for this legislation. And in fact, it would cause more problems than it has done, than it would do save anybody's rights if it were instituted. In the Californian case, I noticed this straight away, that in fact what has already been done is a great deal of harm on the Hindu Indian community there, where their employees, they've already had their reputations irreparably tarnished, whether their children, they're already being vilified and isolated by their peers in schools. These are very real harms. And I think that as time progresses, and especially now that the CRD have dropped the case, there needs to be some element of restitution. There needs to be some element of bringing together the CRD and indeed the Hindu community and sitting down and working out what the cost of actually dealing with the trauma and the harm that has been inflicted is going to be. The Hindu community, I don't think, is going to just turn around, having suffered such vilification and defamation, and say, yes, it's all okay, we've had an apology, we now just carry on. I don't think that would be the way forward. And looking at the passion with which the grassroots are coming together, I think that we're going to see a good result sooner or later. It's inevitable.
Yeah, I mean, you make an important point, because what you're saying is that although in this case, the Cisco case collapsed, during the 3 years when it was making all the headlines, its allegations created fertile ground for Seattle to pass its caste ruling. So now you have a piece of legislation that's already been enacted, albeit on the basis of a fabricated case, But it sets a precedent, doesn't it, that could pave the way for more such rulings, unless, as you mentioned, that it's challenged very robustly and restitution sought, and equal amount of media coverage goes to the other side of the story.
Well, Richa ji, I know, has done a lot of work on the Seattle case. And in fact, I would strongly recommend that all of the viewers have a look at the castfiles.com website. It has got a lot of information, and also Seattle is an area, I think, where we're going to see a great deal of progress. One of the legal advisors, I think, to Cast Files has actually instituted legal proceedings in court against the Seattle councillors or assembly members. Richa ji, perhaps you'd like to share some updates on that. I'm sure it's moving forward very fast.
Absolutely. I think it's faster than how the Indian system works. But yes, there are processes there. We're still waiting for some of the steps to, go forward. But you're right. The one thing we can say is the Hindu community this time is not sitting down quietly, and we are putting up a strong resistance. We have seen much more active participation in Silicon Valley than even in Seattle, because I think people are aware now after Seattle, when the law was passed there, they realized that this is absolutely inimical, and it's absolutely preposterous even, because there are really no cases. And there were open statements by Shama Sawant, who was leading the case in Seattle, that she wants to target Hindu Americans, and there were Khalistani Sikhs who also made some such random comments. So obviously we do see that there is a rising Hinduphobia here, which we cannot ignore. When we saw the Dismantling Global Hindutva conference, I conducted a sentiment analysis using artificial intelligence tools. And what I found was that even though they kept saying that this is to dismantle Hindutva, whatever that is, and not Hinduism, there was direct targeting on Hindus, on Brahmins, on BJP, and a lot of the, Breaking India elements were surfacing in that conference. And the most important thing that I would say is that the caste discussion did come across in that, and they talked about 4 last names like Trivedi, Sharma, Mukherjee, who are corporate malignant Brahmins. And recently I saw there was a social media tweet by a Salesforce executive who said, "Oh, if the last name is Desai, we don't know if we want to hire you." So this sort of thing is getting real. It's going to impact us if people are going to start targeting Indian Americans by their last names. What are we looking at? It reminds me of the Colonizers Criminal Tribes Act, where by the last name or by the tribe they belong to, there were people who were hunted down and, targeted as criminals. So definitely there's a huge backlash on the Hindu American community that has only started to begin in social media. And there have been researches done by a group in New Jersey, the Contagion Group, that absolutely sees a direct impact of social media discussion and discourse on real world hate. And we're seeing that. We're seeing temples being vandalized. We're seeing slurs being cast in restaurants on Hindus or even on streets. We're seeing it in corporates. We're seeing it everywhere. So it's not something we can take lightly. And we are fighting it wherever we have to, even taking the legal recourse.
Please remember to subscribe to us and switch on the notifications for this channel. For our other social media links, more content, and to support our work, please visit citti.net. Dhanyavad. Namaskar.